You think I don't know what you did?" The words scraped from her throat like rusted nails dragged across a tin roof. Eleanor Granger's fingers trembled as she clutched the coarse fur of the old retriever sitting by her hospice bed. Outside, rain needled the windows, sharp and relentless, while the heart monitor ticked a slow, traitorous rhythm. The nurse had just stepped out. The room smelled of antiseptic and wilting lilies, the scent of quiet endings. But Eleanor wasn't done yet. The dog, a golden retriever named Harlow, didn't flinch. He hadn't left her side in days. His muzzle was streaked white with age, his eyes heavy with a sadness that no one could explain. He didn't bark. He never had, not once in all the years he'd been with her. He just watched, listened, and waited. Eleanor's breath caught. She squeezed her eyes shut against the burning in her chest, the one the morphine couldn't touch. But it wasn't the pain of dying that haunted her. It was the weight of something far older, something buried. "I told them it was a fire," she whispered, her eyes flickering to the ceiling as if expecting judgment from somewhere beyond the bland hospital tiles. "But you were there, weren't you, Harlow? You saw what really happened." The dog tilted his head just slightly, as if remembering. Her voice broke. "I didn't mean for it to end that way." Outside the door, footsteps echoed and faded. Again, the hallway, for once, gave her silence. She turned her face back to him. "You were just a pup, barely 3 months old, when I found you on the back porch, shivering under that broken flower pot. I wrapped you in my brother's old sweater, the same one I burned later that night." Harlow didn't move, but the air seemed to shift around him, heavier somehow, like the moment before a storm cracks open the sky. Eleanor looked away, her eyes scanning the tray of untouched food and the wilting daffodils someone had left 2 days ago. She'd refused visitors, not because she didn't want to say goodbye, but because she knew someone might remember. It had been 40 years. A life built atop a silence too thick to pierce. But the guilt had never gone. It had followed her, in mirrors, in shadows, in the quiet spaces between conversations. In Harlow's eyes, she coughed hard. A spot of red bloomed on the edge of the tissue, like a final signature. The dog inched closer. "I thought it was justice," she said quietly. "When the barn went up in flames, I thought maybe I was evening the score." But then he screamed. Her hand shook as it reached for Harlow's paw. He placed it gently in hers, warm and solid. "I never told anyone about the scream. I told the police no one was there. That it was just an accident." She paused, her voice trembling now. "But there was someone. And I watched the fire take him." Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the window pane. Harlow blinked slowly. Then, without warning, he leaned forward, and his muzzle brushed the inside of her palm, and then she heard it. Not bark, not growl. A whisper, a voice not hers, not quite human, brushed the edge of her consciousness. Soft and certain. "You didn't kill him. You saved me." Eleanor froze. Her grip on the dog's paw tightened, her breath caught in her throat, and she stared into those eyes, wide and glistening. She could hear it again, clearer now. "You were a child. You were afraid. But you ran into the smoke. You pulled someone out to know," she mouthed. "That's not. I remember it wrong. You pulled the boy with the burned hand, the one crying for help. He lived." Her lips parted. "James." And suddenly she was there, again, barefoot in the field, her nightgown soaked with smoke and sweat, the barn doors yawning open, flames licking the rafters. Her arm around a sobbing boy who wouldn't stop crying for his father. She had dragged him out, dropped him near the corn barrels and run back, but she hadn't made it inside again. The fire had closed in, the screams had stopped, and when she woke up days later, someone told her everyone inside had died. She hadn't corrected them, not even when she remembered that moment, the dragging, the boy. She'd convinced herself it hadn't happened. Tears slipped down her face. Harlow leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. "You found me after that night," the whisper continued. "You thought I was a stray, but I wasn't." Her heart thudded against her ribcage, not with fear but with something else. Recognition. Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "You're him, aren't you?" The dog didn't answer. Not in words, but something passed between them, something ancient and forgiving. Then the door creaked open, and the nurse stepped in with a quiet smile, clipboard in hand. Eleanor wiped her eyes, slowly letting go of the paw in her hand. "Everything all right?" the nurse asked gently. She nodded. "Yes, just ... remembering something I forgot I did right." Outside, the rain had stopped. The window pane still shimmered with droplets, but the sky behind them had turned pale and still. Inside the room, the dog laid his head beside her hand, and for the first time in 40 years, Eleanor Granger allowed herself to breathe without guilt. But the whisper wasn't the only secret Harlow had carried, and the boy with the burned hand wasn't the only one left behind that night. The nurse didn't notice the tension in the room. She adjusted Eleanor for drip, scribbled something on the clipboard, and offered a kindly smile as she exited. But the second the door clicked shut, Eleanor turned her face back to Harlow, her heart beating faster now than it had in weeks. She stared at the dog, searching his eyes for some trick of medication or mind. The whisper, it couldn't have been real. She was dying, her brain was failing. And yet, there had been something too specific, too lucid, about the voice. Not just words, memory. Truth. Eleanor's hand drifted to the edge of the blanket, where her fingers brushed the soft curve of Harlow's ear. His breathing was slow, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, as if waiting for her to speak. Again she let out a shaky breath and leaned back against the pillows. "I forgot James had freckles," she murmured. "He always stood behind his father, hiding his hands in those frayed overalls." Her eyes unfocused, distant now. "The others they didn't like when he followed us down to the creek, said he was too soft, but I always thought he was just lonely." The storm had passed outside, leaving behind the hush that follows heavy rain. Cars whispered by on wet roads. Somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped twice and went silent. "I wasn't supposed to be there that night," she continued. "I heard them laughing in the barn. I knew they'd been drinking, but I went anyway, because I thought if I saw it with my own eyes, maybe it wouldn't feel like betrayal." Her voice broke again. "I saw him, my father, with her. Not Mama, not anyone I recognized. And I ran." She swallowed, then looked at Harlow. "But you know that, don't you? You've always known." Harlow didn't move, but something in the air tightened again, as if time itself was drawing breath. "I don't understand," Eleanor whispered. "How are you still here? That fire was decades ago. You weren't even born." The dog's eyes held hers, steady and ancient, as if waiting for her to let the truth come on its own. Her mind drifted again, not in confusion, in clarity. She remembered the old man who'd given her the retriever in a rusted cage behind the hardware store. She'd been 47, newly retired, living alone. The man had no name on the receipt, no phone number, just a crooked smile and a soft pat on Harlow's head. "He doesn't bark," the man had said, "but he remembers." She hadn't thought much of it then. Now it chilled her. A low creak echoed from the window frame as the temperature dropped. Eleanor reached for her robe, but her limbs felt heavier than before. Her eyes blinked slowly, each one a little harder to reopen, and sound, soft but sharp, snapped her fully awake. The whisper again, closer this time. Not all of them made it out. Eleanor's hand clutched at the blanket. "What do you mean?" "Not James, someone else." Images surged in her memory like water breaching a dam, flickers of flame, wood collapsing, the shriek of horses in the paddock. She had run out with James, yes, but when she tried to go back, someone had grabbed her, pulled her down, told her to stay down. "A man, gray coat," she whispered, "boots with one missing lace, a silver ring." And then she remembered not just pulling James out, but being pulled away, forced to lie in the wet grass as the barn exploded in sparks. The man had whispered something to her before disappearing into the smoke. "No one else comes out." She'd buried that moment, rewritten it. But now it returned in perfect clarity. Eleanor's voice was hoarse. "You saw him too, didn't you?" Harlow's ears twitched, just once. "What was in that barn?" she asked. "What were they hiding?" The room darkened slightly as clouds passed over the moon. In that shadowed pause, Eleanor felt something new unraveling, not guilt this time, but fear. The kind that doesn't come from regret, but from realizing a story you've lived your whole life might never have been yours to tell. She reached again for Harlow's paw. "Tell me." The silence that followed stretched too long. Then came the whisper, slower, colder. "He wasn't your father." Eleanor's heart stilled. The words didn't compute at first. "He took the name, took the land, took the child, but he wasn't your father." She stared at the dog, her face pale, the oxygen tubes rattling faintly as her breath caught in her throat. "My father died in that barn." No answer came, only the steady hum of the machines and the rise and fall of fur under her palm. And then, the last memory hit, not a fire, not screams, not fear, but a woman's voice singing behind a door. A lullaby in a tongue she didn't understand. The door locked, her mother crying. The man in the gray coat standing on the porch, not father. Stranger then. "Who am I?" Eleanor whispered, and the dog blinked once. "You're the one who survived." In the hallway the nurse returned with a new saline bag, but she hesitated before opening the door, her hand hovering midair. Inside, the room was silent again, but something old had been broken, and something much older was waking up. The rain hadn't stopped. It hammered the windows now like it wanted to be let in, as if the storm itself had something to say. Eleanor's breaths came in smaller gulps, ribcage fluttering under the weight of memory and morphine. The nurse had dimmed the lights before, leaving, casting the room in amber hush, but shadows still clung to the corners like old regrets. Harlow hadn't moved. He lay with his head nestled against her wrist, eyes half closed, watching the rise and fall of her frail chest. The whisper from earlier still rang in her ears, soft, strange, impossibly real. "You saved me." It made no sense. And yet, the more she tried to convince herself it was a dying mind playing tricks, the more something deeper pushed back. A forgotten truth, waiting patiently beneath decades of dust. "I can't take this with me," she murmured. "Not this time." Her gaze drifted to the old wooden box on the nightstand, locked, stained, untouched since the day she was admitted. She reached for it, fingers trembling, but her body rebelled halfway. The box slid off the table and clattered to the floor. Harlow lifted his head sharply, ears twitching. The lid popped open on impact, and a single photograph fluttered out. A small, black and white image faded around the edges. Eleanor stared at it, her breath catching. Two children stood in front of a collapsing barn, a girl in muddy shoes, a boy with one hand in a sling. Behind them, something burned, not flames, but memory. Her heart pounded. Not from fear, from recognition. The boy wasn't James. He wasn't even from their family. She hadn't known his name then, only that he was there, hiding behind hay bales when the fighting started. Eleanor had seen her uncle shove someone rough, violent, shouting something about silence and shame, and then the smell of gasoline. She had dragged the boy out. He was screaming, crying for a mother who never came. Later, the town buried 3 bodies, her uncle, 2 others. No one asked about the boy. Eleanor had never told a soul, and yet here she was, dying, and the dog at her side was whispering truths she had long buried. "Harlow," she said, voice fragile. "You're not just a comfort, are you?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, impossibly, the dog sat up. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He just stared, calm, unblinking, and there, in that silent, electric stillness, she felt it again. Not words, but knowing. Her hand drifted to his collar, running along the worn leather. Beneath it her fingers brushed something metal. Not a tag, but a flat disc. She hadn't noticed it before. She pulled it free and brought it closer. The engraving was almost worn smooth, but one word was still clear. Jacob. Her throat closed. No, that can't be. Her mind raced. Jacob, that was the boy's name. She'd only heard it once, when he whispered it to her, choking on smoke, clutching her shirt as she pulled him away from the fire. His eyes had been wide, terrified. He couldn't have been more than 5. The boy had vanished. No police report, no follow-up. The town assumed he'd been claimed by the fire like the rest. But he hadn't. She had saved him. And now, she looked back at the dog, no longer seeing a retriever, but something older, deeper, a watcher, a memory keeper. Somehow, impossibly, a vessel of what was lost. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Why did you come back? Harlow, or Jacob, or whatever part of him remained in this gentle animal, moved closer again, pressing his forehead to hers in a quiet gesture of grace. And then she understood. Forgiveness wasn't just something you asked for. Sometimes it found you anyway. But even as warmth settled into her chest, another cold truth slithered in. The fire hadn't been an accident. She knew that now with piercing clarity. Her uncle had started it. Yes, but not because of rage alone. There had been something else, a reason for his violence, a reason he wanted silence. Eleanor's hands gripped the bedsheets. It wasn't just Jacob who'd been in danger that night. It was what he had seen. A noise echoed down the hallway, voices, hushed but urgent. A new visitor had arrived. The nurse's voice responded in surprise. Then footsteps, slow, purposeful, drawing near. Harlow shifted his weight, ears turning toward the door. His posture stiffened, alert. Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice was barely a rasp. Who? The door opened with a soft creak. A man stood in the entryway, tall, mid-40s, in a rain-slicked coat. He carried no umbrella, no flowers, no warmth. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Eleanor, then flicked to the dog beside her. She felt the temperature drop. The man stepped in, closing the door gently behind him. "I was told she asked for me." The nurse's voice echoed faintly down the corridor, confused. She didn't. Eleanor's pulse stuttered. She didn't recognize his face, but something about the eyes. Familiar, watching. Harlow growled. For the first time in his life, he growled. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. "You've kept quiet a long time, Eleanor," he said softly, "but I think it's time we talked about what really happened in that barn." The rain hit harder now. The dog stood between them, silent, tense, and Eleanor understood. The fire hadn't taken everyone. Someone had walked away, and not all ghosts came to forgive. The next morning brought a strange silence. Eleanor's body was still weak, frail as a shadow stitched to the bed, but something behind her eyes had changed. The nurse noticed it first, a sharpness, not of energy, but of clarity, as though Eleanor had finally climbed out of a fog that had choked her for decades. Harlow lay curled beside her, just as before, but now the weight of his presence felt different. He wasn't just comforting her anymore. He was waiting. Eleanor had not spoken of what happened in the night, not to the nurse, not to the hospice chaplain who stopped by with soft platitudes. But when the door clicked shut behind each visitor, her hand would slide toward Harlow's paw again. Her fingers, though fragile, traced the ridge of his toes like she was searching for something she could no longer afford to leave buried. By early afternoon, she asked for a phone. Not to call family, she had none left, but to find someone she hadn't spoken to in for decades. The hospital Wi-Fi was weak, but it was enough. Her eyes scanned the screen slowly, her thumb trembling as she typed his name, James Holloway. The search brought up a local mechanic, a man in his 50s, burned hand, still used the same last name. Her breath hitched. She wrote a message, just 2 sentences, and hit send. Then she lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling like it might open and finally give her answers. An hour passed. Then to and then her phone buzzed. The reply was brief, no punctuation. Just a, "Remember you, in here, can I come?" She closed her eyes and nodded to no one, but before she could respond, Harlow sat up. Eleanor turned toward him. "You felt it, didn't you?" she whispered. The dog looked toward the door, then back at her, and then something shifted. The light in the room dimmed, though the curtains hadn't moved. The shadows at the corners of the room seemed to stretch a little longer, like old memories crawling back into form. Eleanor's pulse fluttered. "You're not just him," she said. Slowly, "you single quotes read ... more." For the first time in 4 days, Harlow stood. The pads of his feet made no sound on the linoleum as he stepped toward the foot of the bed, his eyes locked with hers. And as Eleanor struggled to rise, breath shallow, her voice cracked into a whisper, only meant for the silence between them. "You were there before the fire, weren't you?" He didn't nod, didn't speak, but somehow the answer filled the room. Eleanor's memory flickered, half-formed images blooming like oil on water, a child's laughter, a golden blur darting through a field, a voice calling, a name that wasn't Harlow, not yet. The sound of flames, the scream, but another figure too, one she had never seen clearly until now, a shape in the shadows, watching. Her hands trembled. "There was someone else in that barn," she said, her voice hollow. "Someone neither of us saved." Harlow didn't move, but his presence seemed to draw the truth out of her chest like smoke. She began to cry. "Her name was Marion," Eleanor whispered. "She'd followed me in. I didn't know. She was just trying to stop me, and when the beam fell, I ran. I ran right past her. I never turned back." The air turned still. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then Harlow took one step forward, and in that step his eyes shifted, not in color, but in depth. Eleanor gasped. She saw the girl, not as a ghost, not in the flesh, but behind his gaze, as though she'd been watching all along, living in the silent pauses between breaths, buried inside the unspoken grief Eleanor had refused to face. "She followed me to stop me from lighting the match," Eleanor said, her voice shattering, but I was already shaking the kerosene. "I thought I was punishing him. My stepfather. I didn't know she was there." A knock jolted the room. Eleanor froze. Another knock, then a voice, low, familiar. "Eleanor, James." She looked at Harlow. He stared back, unwavering, and for a moment she didn't feel sick or old or broken. She felt 10 again, barefoot, soot-covered, staring at a fire she couldn't take back. Then she whispered, "He's the only one left who knows what I did." Harlow finally stepped aside, his head bowing ever so slightly, as if granting her permission to open the door to her past. The nurse let James in. He was older now, with lines carved deep into his brow, and that same burned hand resting stiffly at his side. He walked slowly to her bedside, eyes flicking to the dog before settling on her. "I always wondered if you remembered me," he said. "I did," she whispered, "but I buried it, just like I buried Marion." He didn't speak for a long time. Then he pulled a small folded newspaper, clipping from his pocket, and handed it to her. Eleanor unfolded it with shaking hands. "Local girl dies in fire. No foul play suspected." There was a photograph, grainy, Marion's face, smiling, not yet lost. "I saw her go in," James said, "but I never told anyone. I was afraid they'd blame me or you or both. I never even told myself." Eleanor murmured, "But he remembered." James frowned. "Who?" She nodded toward Harlow. James glanced at the dog, then back at her. "That's just a dog, Eleanor." She looked him dead in the eye. "No, that's the memory we both ran from." And he came back. And then her heart stuttered, not from fear, not from grief, but because, finally, the truth had a voice. But what neither of them yet knew was this: Harlow hadn't returned. For Eleanor alone, there was still one secret left to rise from the ash. The window let in the pale gold of evening light, soft and slanting, painting long shadows across Eleanor's sheets. She looked smaller now, her breath thinner, her voice almost gone. James sat beside her, silent, the folded clipping still on the table between them. Harlow lay at her feet, unmoving, but his eyes stayed on her face, as if he were holding her tethered just long enough. "I thought I could carry it to the end," she murmured, "but memory has a way of finding its own breath." James reached for her hand and didn't speak, just held it. There were no confessions left, no accusations, just two people who had once lived through fire and silence. Finally letting both go, Eleanor turned her head, her fingers brushing the soft fur of Harlow's neck. Her lips moved faintly. "Tell her I'm sorry." And Harlow looked up. It was not a bark, not a cry, just a slow blink, and then the sound of wind outside, brushing through the leaves as if someone had exhaled. In that moment, Eleanor's chest rose one last time, and then gently, as if the weight had finally lifted, it fell. James sat still. The machine behind her went quiet. The nurse came in a minute later, then quietly stepped back out. There was nothing frantic, no alarms, just the hush of something complete. Outside, the clouds began to break. James turned to the dog. "You were waiting for her to remember, weren't you?" Harlow didn't answer, but as the light shifted, his figure seemed to soften at the edges, less animal, more presence. And then, without sound, he stood, walked to the window, and lay down in the sun. James looked back at Eleanor's face. There was peace there now. Not forgiveness, not erasure, just truth, after all those years. And somewhere, in the fading gold, a girl's laughter echoed faintly through the wind.